Lakshmi walked down the dimly lit street, her tired feet dragging against the rough pavement. The air smelled of damp cloth and factory smoke, a reminder of the long hours she spent inside those walls. She adjusted the worn-out shawl draped over her shoulders, shielding herself from the cold breeze. Her shift had ended late again, and she knew her aunt would be waiting, not with concern, but with another list of chores. At home, the small, cramped space barely felt like a place to rest. Her aunt sat on the wooden cot, eyes sharp, arms crossed. "Took your sweet time, didn't you?" The woman's voice was laced with irritation. Without waiting for an answer, she pointed to the stack of unwashed dishes. "Get to it." Lakshmi didn't argue. She never did. She simply lowered her gaze and walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling as they met the cold water. This had been her life for as long as she could remember. Her parents had died when she was too young to understand loss, and ever since, her existence had been reduced to labor, at home, at the factory, in every corner of her life. But in stolen moments, when the world wasn't watching, she allowed herself to dream. She had a sketchbook hidden beneath her cot, filled with hurried drawings made in the dim light of a candle. Art was the only thing that made her feel alive, the only thing that was hers. One night, while walking home, something caught her eye, a discarded painting lying beside an overflowing trash bin. The colors, though faded and torn, still held emotion, still told a story. Lakshmi's fingers traced the lines carefully, as if touching something sacred. She clutched the painting to her chest and hurried home. That night, she stared at it for hours, imagining the artist behind it, wondering if they, too, had once felt trapped. For the first time in years, a fire burned inside her. But morning came, and reality crashed in. The sound of her aunt's voice snapped her back to her place in the world. "Get up, Lakshmi. Do you think this house will run itself?" Lakshmi shoved the painting under her cot and stepped into the day, carrying her dreams like a secret. The factory air was thick with the scent of sweat and dye, machines whirring relentlessly. Lakshmi kept her head down, stitching fabric as the supervisor's voice barked orders. Just another day, another endless cycle. But that morning, something different happened. A woman in an elegant sari walked through the factory doors, her presence demanding attention. Workers whispered, Mrs. Mehta, a wealthy art patron, was looking for temporary help at her home. Names were called, hands raised, but it was Lakshmi's silence that caught the supervisor's eye. "You go?" There was no choice in the matter. She wiped her hands on her tattered shawl and followed. Mrs. Mehta's house was unlike anything Lakshmi had ever seen. Tall glass windows, walls lined with books and paintings. A world so distant from her own that it felt like a dream. She was instructed to clean the floors of an upstairs studio, a task she accepted without question. But as she swept, her eyes wandered to the canvases propped against the walls, colors bleeding into each other, emotions spilling onto paper. Something inside her stirred. Her hands itched for a pencil, a brush, anything. Hesitantly, she picked up a discarded piece of charcoal and traced a figure on the back of an old newspaper. Lost in the motion, she forgot everything, her aunt, the factory, even where she was. A voice cut through the air.
"Who taught you to draw like that?"
Lakshmi's heart stopped. She turned to see Mrs. Mehta watching, arms crossed but eyes filled with something that wasn't anger. Lakshmi dropped the charcoal, scrambling to her feet. I didn't mean to." Mrs. Mehta held up a hand. "Calm down. You have talent. Why waste it cleaning floors?" Lakshmi couldn't answer. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever acknowledged her dreams. Mrs. Mehta studied her for a long moment. "If you want, I can help you."
"Teach you. But it's your choice."
The words were too big, too impossible. Lakshmi had never been given a choice. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of learning art felt like grasping at the moon, beautiful but unreachable. Her aunt's voice rang in her head. "You were born to serve, not dream." But for the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to spend her life hidden in the shadows. Maybe she could be more. Lakshmi stood at the doorstep, her heart pounding. The weight of Mrs. Mehta's offer lingered in her mind, but fear held her back. That night, she gathered the courage to speak. "Aunt, I want to learn art." The response was instant. A slap echoed through the small room, sharp and final. "Art," her aunt scoffed. "You think you're special? You're nothing. You belong here, working, not chasing foolish dreams." Tears stung Lakshmi's eyes, but she swallowed them. She had expected this. Still, hearing it out loud hurt in ways she hadn't anticipated.
For days, she hesitated.
Every time she passed the factory, every time she scrubbed the floors, she convinced herself that her aunt was right. But at night, her hands moved on their own, sketching shadows and light, longing for more. The breaking point came when she overheard her aunt speaking to the factory supervisor. "She's getting ideas above her station. If she tries anything, put her in her place." Something inside Lakshmi snapped. She would not live and die in this cycle of servitude. Before dawn, she gathered her few belongings, her sketchbook, the charcoal pencil Mrs. Mehta had left out for her, and a small cloth bag. Without looking back, she stepped into the unknown. Mrs. Mehta welcomed her with a knowing look. "I was hoping you'd come." Lakshmi threw herself into learning, soaking up everything like dry earth meeting rain. She practiced endlessly, her fingers stained with colors she had never been allowed to touch before. For the first time, she felt alive. But the world was not ready to let her go so easily. The whispers started. Workers at the factory, neighbors who had always looked through her. "She thinks she's better than us. Ungrateful girl. She'll come crawling back." The words found their way to her aunt. One afternoon, Lakshmi returned from a lesson to find the woman waiting outside Mrs. Mehta's house, eyes burning with fury. "Enough of this nonsense," she spat. "You're coming home." Lakshmi clenched her fists. The old fear crept in, but so did something else, resolve. "No." Her aunt's face twisted in shock. "What did you say?" Lakshmi lifted her chin, her voice steady. "I'm not coming back." Her aunt scoffed, turning to Mrs. Mehta. "You're filling her head with lies. Who will accept a girl like hers?" Mrs. Mehta didn't answer. She didn't need to, because standing behind her, looking at Lakshmi's latest painting, was someone who could change everything. The man studying Lakshmi's painting had an air of quiet authority. His gaze lingered on the strokes, the raw emotion captured in colors. Then he turned to her. "This is remarkable. Who is the artist?" Lakshmi hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am." A slow nod. "You have talent. The kind that deserves to be seen." He handed Mrs. Mehta his card. "I want this piece in my next exhibition." Lakshmi's heart stopped. An exhibition. Her work displayed for the world to see. It felt unreal. But before she could process it, her aunt's bitter laugh sliced through the air. "An exhibition? Do you hear yourself? She's a factory girl, not an artist." Lakshmi met her gaze, no longer trembling. "I am an artist." Her aunt's eyes narrowed. "And what if you fail? What if they laugh at you?" Lakshmi took a breath. "Then I'll keep painting." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, the power had shifted. The woman who had controlled her fate for years saw something she couldn't break, certainty. With a final glare, her aunt turned and walked away, her hold over Lakshmi shattering with each step. Days passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Mehta guided her through the world of art galleries and critics, but the doubt never fully disappeared. As the exhibition day approached, fear clawed at Lakshmi's resolve. But when she stepped into the gallery, surrounded by paintings, her painting, something inside her settled. People murmured in appreciation, eyes drawn to her work. A critic stopped in front of it, nodding. "This artist has a voice. A story worth telling." Lakshmi exhaled. It wasn't just about the painting. It was about everything it represented. Every night spent sketching in secret, every insult endured, every moment she chose to fight instead of surrender. As the evening ended, a woman approached her, holding a letter. "A scholarship," she explained. "A formal art education, if you're willing." Lakshmi's fingers tightened around the paper. She had spent her life believing she had no choices. Now, the world was opening to her. Outside, the city lights shimmered. She glanced at her hands, once calloused from endless labor, now stained with paint. A life she had only dared to imagine was finally within reach. For the first time, Lakshmi didn't look back. She stepped forward, into the life she had chosen.